The Duke of Stanmere did not look up when she stood. He was reading a paper, and he said it into the room without raising his eyes. "Bring me a man who understands water." And 40 men laughed, and Verity Allard went on standing with her father's book held flat against her chest until the laughter had finished with her and there was nowhere left to stand. Then she sat down. The assembly room at Blakenhithe smelled of wet wool and tallow and coffee the innkeeper had burned. Rain came down the tall windows in ropes. The man on the bench beside her patted the wood and said, "There now," which was worse than the laughing. 5 months later, on the 25th of March, that same Duke would stand in the rain outside her gate with his hat in his hands and ask her for 2 things. She would give him the first at once. The second took until dawn. But that was Lady Day, and this was October. And in October the room was warm and full and sure of itself, and she was the only person in it who had ever read the water. The meeting had been called for 11 o'clock, and it was gone 1, and in those 2 hours the Court of Sewers for Long Fen had heard a gentleman from London describe a straight line. His name was Crispin Hale. He was 40, sandy, gold-spectacled, and he had a roll of drawings as long as an oar, and when he spread them across the table the paper was so white it hurt to look at. 9 miles, he said. 40 feet across at the top, 16 at the bottom, a fall of 1 inch in the mile, cut from the head of the fen to the river below the bend, and the whole crooked business of the old drain, which wandered, he said, like a man looking for his hat, done away with forever. 4,000 acres freed, 700 of them his Grace's own low ground, the best black soil in 3 counties, drowned every winter since anybody could remember and worth nothing but reed and eel and argument. "Let it dry," said Mr. Hale, "and it will grow wheat that would frighten a Lincolnshire man." Lady Day was the date. The Act said the works must be let and begun by the 25th of March, or the Act would lapse and every subscriber would eat his own costs. The room liked that. The room liked a date. Men who had spent their whole lives waiting on water liked being told, at last, the day it would stop. Verity had come in at the back with mud to her knees, because there was no dry way from the gate to the town in October, and there never had been. She was 23. She had her father's book under her cloak to keep the rain off it, a black leather thing with a broken spine and a strap, and inside it, in 3 hands, her grandfather's, her father's, and her own, were the heights of the ground and the river at the Reeves Gate on the first Sunday of every month since the year 1793. 22 years. She had held the staff herself since she was 9 years old, standing in the wet while her father squinted through the level and read the number aloud twice. Always twice. Because a number said once was only a rumor. She had waded through the whole of Mr. Hale's line. Then she had stood up. And the Duke had said his sentence. And that was that. Outside, the market was packing itself away in the rain. She untied the pony, and Jabez Rans came out of the ship with his hat down and his coat gone black across the shoulders, and did not quite look at her. He was 62, and he had pulled a lighter up and down her father's drain for 40 years, and he had been in the room, and he had laughed. Not loudly, but he had. "Girl," he said. "Mr. Rans, you shouldn't have stood up." "No," she said. "I should have brought a man." He worked his jaw at that. "That ain't what I meant. It's what he meant." Rans looked at the sky, which was the color of a dead fire. "He's a young duke," he said. "Young dukes want it finished." "Everybody wants it finished," Verity said. "It isn't a thing that finishes." She got up on the pony and rode home the long way, along the top of the old bank, because the short way had been under a foot of water since Michaelmas. Home was the Reeves house, one room down, one up, a chimney that smoked when the wind sat in the east, and it stood on a quarter of an acre of hard ground called the Reeves Rood, and that rood was the only hard ground for 2 miles in any direction. It was not luck. Under Long Fen, buried in the peat, lay the bed of a river that had died before the Romans came, and its silt had set like a road, and where it ran the ground was firm and a foot higher than everything about it. The Fen men called such a thing a rodden. You could see it from the bank on a dry morning, a pale seam wandering through the black, going nowhere anybody living had ever needed to go. Her house sat on it. So did the gate. The gate was 300 years old in its stonework and 60 in its timbers, 2 oak doors in a throat of stone, a windlass, an iron key as long as her forearm to work the pin, and a wall running out from either side into the peat. Everything Long Fen let go of went out through it. Everything the river tried to push back was stopped at it. Her father had drawn it and shut it 4 times a day for 30 years. And his father before him. And the office had a name, which was Dyke Reeve, and a wage of £11 a year that had not been paid since the old Duke died, and a right nobody had thought about in 100 years. And a book. The book was the point. She hung her cloak, lit the fire, dried her hands on her apron, and opened it on the table at the page for 1813, where the bookmark was, a folded paper the steward had written out and handed her at the manor court 3 weeks after they buried her father. She had used it as a bookmark because it was stiff and the right size. She had read it once, on the day, in a cold room, when she was 21 and could not have told you her own name if you had asked her twice. Her father died of standing in water. That is not a physician's phrase, but it is the true one. In the January flood of 1813, he had been 3 days on the wall in the wet, and he came home gray. And he sat in that chair by that fire and said the drain had done well, and on the 9th day he was dead. Ambrose Allard, 48 years old. The last thing he ever said to her that was about anything was, "Read it twice." He meant the level. He meant all of it. So she read it twice, every first Sunday, alone, which is harder than it sounds, because a level wants 2 people and one of them must hold the staff. She had made a stand for it out of a broken oar and a brick, and on every first Sunday for nearly 3 years she had walked out to the iron post her father drove in 1793 and written down what the Fen had done since the month before. The post was what she had wanted to say in the assembly room. In 1793, when the first straight cut was made at the head of the Fen, Ambrose Allard had driven an iron post down through the peat until it stood on the clay beneath it, and then he had cut its head off level with the ground, so that the top of the post and the surface of the Fen were the same thing on the same day. Anyone could have done it. Nobody else did. In October of 1815, the post stood 5 feet 3 inches out of the ground. The post had not risen. The Fen had gone down. That is what draining does to peat, and it was not a secret, and any Fen man over 50 would have told you the ground sinks when you dry it. But nobody had written it down for 22 years in one place, in 3 hands, with the dates set against it. Dry peat wastes. It shrinks. It blows off in the August wind in a black cloud that puts the sun out over the town for an afternoon. It burns underground for a month if a boy drops a pipe on it. And every year it is a little lower, and the harder you drain it, the faster it goes. 5 feet 3 inches in 22 years, and that from a lazy, crooked old drain that only worked half the year. Mr. Hale's line would take it faster. And here was the arithmetic that had put her on her feet in a room full of men who had known her since she was in leading strings. The Duke's 700 acres of low ground, the best black soil in 3 counties, sat at present 2 feet and 4 inches above the top water of the river. 2 feet 4. That was the whole of the estate's argument with the sea. Cut the new line, dry that peat down hard and fast, and the ground would go out from under it, and when the ground falls below the river, the water will not run out of it any more. Not ever. Not with the finest engineering in England, because water does not climb. You would be buying pumps for 100 years to keep your wheat from drowning, and paying for the coal to drive them, and your grandsons would be paying for the coal, and the fen would go on sinking underneath the whole time. Because that is what a dried fen does. Verity Allard, aged 23, unmarried, muddy, sitting alone in a one-room house on a 1/4 acre of Roman silt, was the only person in the county who could prove it. She had a book, a post, and a church. She had no man. She wrote 3 letters in 9 days. The first she wrote plainly, and it took her 4 hours and 2 candles. She said that a record of the height of the ground at the Reeves Gate had been kept every month since 1793, that it showed a fall of 5 feet 3 inches, that the low ground stood 2 feet 4 inches above top water, and that she would be glad to show His Grace the post on any day he cared to name. She signed it with her name and her father's office. Mr. Ocean Peart, the steward, answered it in 6 lines. His Grace was obliged to her for her interest. His Grace had engaged Mr. Hale of London, whose reputation required no assistance. The office of Dyke Reeve being in abeyance, Mr. Peart added, its papers were of course the property of nobody in particular, and if she wished to deposit them at the estate office they would be looked after. She read that last sentence 11 times, standing up, with her coat still on. The second letter was shorter, and she kept a copy of it. The third she wrote at midnight and burned at 1, because there was nothing in it but temper, and temper is not evidence. So she stopped writing letters and went back to work, because the gate did not care what anybody in London had engaged. The rain came on hard in the 2nd week of November, and she was out at 4 and at 8 and at 1 and at 6 with the key on her shoulder, drawing at the ebb, shutting before the tide made, and when the wind backed northeast on the 19th, she did not go to bed at all. On the 21st he came. He came alone, which surprised her more than his coming at all. She was out at the post with the staff on its brick when she heard the horse. She did not turn round, because she had the number nearly in the glass, and losing it meant another 1/4 of an hour, so what the Duke of Stanmere saw first was a figure in a dead man's oilskin coat, 3 sizes too large, standing in 6 inches of water with its back to him, entirely uninterested in a duke. He waited. That was the first surprising thing about him. "I'm looking for the Reeves Gate," he said at last. "You're standing on it," she said, and wrote the number down, and read it again, and wrote it again underneath, and then straightened up and turned round. He was perhaps 30, tall, black-haired, clean-shaven, in a caped greatcoat that had cost more than her house, and his boots were ruined, and he had ridden 9 miles in the rain on a Tuesday to look at a ditch. He looked at her face for a moment too long. "You're the woman who stood up," he said. "I am. I didn't see you." "No," she said. "You were reading." She had rehearsed a great many sentences for this man across 9 days, and every one of them left her at once, so she did the only thing she was good at. She held out the book. He took it with both hands, which she noticed, and he did not open it. "Explain the post," he said. So she explained the post. She stood in the water in her father's coat and told him about 1793, and the clay and the head cut off level with the ground, and she showed him the iron standing up out of the fen with 5 feet 3 inches of its length in the air and the marks of 22 Augusts on it. And she watched him do the thing that decided everything that came afterwards, which was that he went and put his hand on the post. Not on the drawing of the post, on the post. "Peat settles," he said. "It settles for a year or two after you drain it. Everybody knows that." "Everybody's right," she said. "Settling stops." This has not stopped. Look at the years. The years are in your handwriting. The last 2 are in mine. The other 20 are in my father's and my grandfather's, and Mr. Hale can look at the ink and tell you it wasn't written last Thursday, if you'd like him to. His mouth moved. It was not a smile, but it had been thinking about it. "And if the post has sunk," he said, "iron is heavy. If your post has sunk 5 feet 3 inches into your clay and the ground has stood still, your book says the same number and means the opposite thing." She had waited 9 days for a man to ask her that question. "Come to the church," she said. He came to the church. It took until the 11th of December, because a duke's diary is a slower animal than a fen, and by then the fen had risen twice, and the lower road was gone, and he came the last mile in a punt with Jabez Rands polling and saying nothing at all, in a very loud way. The church at Blakenheath stands where the Rawdon comes up out of the fen, on silt and clay. And it has stood there since the wool money, and it does not move. And everybody in 3 parishes knows it does not move, because the tower has a crack in it that has not widened in living memory. Reverend Amos Kitteridge was 70 and had been curate here in 1793, and he came out into the wet churchyard in his black coat, with his hands behind his back, and led them to the foot of the tower without being asked twice, because he had been waiting 15 years for somebody to want this. There was a mark cut in the plinth, a broad arrow with a line under it, chiseled into the stone, half filled with lichen, at about the height of a man's knee. Ambrose Allard cut that, the rector said, in April. He was a young man, and he had a chisel, and I told him the churchwardens would have his hide, and they didn't. They paid him for it. And he took them inside, out of the rain, and opened the churchwarden's account book at the year 1793. And there it was in a dead man's hand, between a shilling for candles and 4 shillings for a new lock, paid to A. Allard for a mark cut in the plinth, 1 shilling and 6 pence. The Duke read it twice. He was learning. "It's a witness," Verity said. "That's all it is." In April of 1793, the surface of the fen at the post stood 4 feet 1 inch below that mark. My father wrote it in the book that same week, and the churchwardens wrote the shilling and 6 pence in theirs, and neither of them knew what he was doing it for. In October, the ground at the post stood 9 feet 4 inches below the mark. "Take one from the other, your grace. 5 feet 3. 5 feet 3. The church has not sunk. The post has not sunk. If they had, they would not agree, and they agree to the inch." Rain went on the window. The rector, who had the sense of a man who had spent 50 years in a small parish, said nothing whatever. "Mr. Hale will say the mark was recut," the Duke said. "Mr. Hale is welcome to bring a glass and look at the lichen." And she saw it land. That was the moment, in a cold church in December, with a rector pretending to dust a book, the Duke of Stanmere understood that she was right. She watched him understand it. And she watched him, immediately afterwards, begin looking for a way that it might not matter. It took him 9 days to find one, and it came by letter, and the letter was from Crispin Hale, and it was, she admitted to the fire at 2 a.m, a good letter. Mr. Hale did not sneer. That was the trouble with him. He wrote to her as one man writes to another, which he plainly believed was a great compliment, and he granted her everything: the post, the mark, the shilling and sixpence, the 5 feet 3. He granted the whole of it, and then he took it away with one paragraph. The fall, he said, was historic. It had been produced by 22 years of a bad drain, and it was now, in the nature of such things, substantially spent. Peat wastes fastest when first dried, and afterwards approaches an equilibrium, as demonstrated in the North Level, in Deeping, and in Holland. Her father's numbers, he said, described the disease of an old system and could not be made to prophesy under a new one. And besides, he wrote, and here was the whole of London in 11 words: the low ground is presently under water half the year, and grows nothing. A farm that sinks slowly is worth more than a swamp that does not sink at all. She sat with that until the fire went down, because he was not stupid. He was right about the North Level, and he was right about Deeping, and he was right that a slow sinking farm beats a swamp, and if you had shown that letter to any subscriber in the county, he would have signed his name to the cut before he finished it. It took her 3 days to find the answer, and she found it not in the book but in her own legs, walking the top of the bank in the sleet from the gate to the head of the fen and back, 11 miles, with the numbers going round. Mr. Hale's equilibrium was true. It was true for peat that is drained to a level and then left there. But peat does not come to rest at a level. It comes to rest at the water. It stops wasting when the ground has fallen far enough to reach the water again, and that is the whole of the trick. And that is why her father's crooked, useless, wandering drain, which every gentleman in the room had laughed at, had only let the fen down 5 feet 3 inches in 22 years, while Deeping had lost 8, because the old drain was too lazy to take the summer water away, because it kept the level up in May and June and July when the peat was thirsty, and only worked in winter when the peat was wet anyway, and could not be hurt. Her grandfather had not built a bad drain. He had built a slow one on purpose, and then 2 generations of clever men had looked at it and seen a mistake. Cut Mr. Hale's line, with its fall of an inch in the mile and its 40 feet of throat, and the fen would find the water again in 11 years, at a depth of 9 feet or thereabouts, 9 feet down from where it stood now. And the low ground stood 2 feet 4 inches above the river. She wrote it out in a fair hand on 4 sheets, with the years, the church, the North Level, and the number 9, and she took it to the estate office herself on the 2nd of January, and she did not send it. She put it into Mr. Peart's hands. Miss Peart was 58 and gray at the side whiskers, and had kept the rent roll for 19 years, and he took the 4 sheets between his finger and thumb as though she had handed him a wet fish. He was not a wicked man. He was a tired one. And he had a duke who had come home from London 2 years ago at 29, with his father's ruin in one hand and an Act of Parliament in the other, and Mr. Peart had learned that the fastest road to a quiet office was to agree. "I'll lay it before His Grace," he said. "You'll lay it before him today." Miss Allard, "Mr. Peart, in 7 weeks you are going to let a contract for £9,400 of other men's money on a plan that will put His Grace's best land under the river inside a generation, and when it happens you will still be alive, and so will I, and so will your rent roll." His pen stopped. She had not raised her voice. That was what he told his wife about, afterwards, when it all came out, that the girl had never once raised her voice at him. He laid it before the Duke that day. And now you should understand the man she was fighting, because he was not a villain, and it would be easier for everybody if he had been. Julian Ashworth had not wanted a dukedom. He had wanted his father to live longer than he did, and to spend less than he did. And neither wish had been granted, and at 29 he had come home to an estate with a hole in it and 400 people in it and cottages at the fen edge that took water into the ground floor 3 winters running. He had seen a child carried out of one of them on a door. He had gone up to Parliament himself, personally, unfashionably, and stood up in a thin house on a wet Tuesday and got the Long Fen Drainage Act through with his own name at the top of it and 41 subscribers behind it. Most of them neighbors. One of them his mother's brother. He had promised those people dry ground. He had promised it out loud, and a young man who has promised something out loud in front of his neighbors will do a great deal before he will say the word wait. Because that was all she was offering him. Not a triumph. Not a straight white line 9 miles long that would look magnificent on a wall in London. She was offering him a crooked ditch, widened, kept where his grandfather's grandfather had put it, and the water held up all summer on purpose, and 101 small, unglamorous years of doing it properly. And in the middle of Mr. Hale's plan, printed in the schedule in a fine copper plate, was the piece that paid for everything. The 100. 240 acres of common between the 2 old banks at the bottom of the fen, where the water had been let to go every winter since anybody could remember, and where the fen men grazed their beasts every June when it dried, and which the new cut would take dry forever, and enclose and sell as arable to the subscribers at £11 the acre. That was the profit. That was why 41 men had signed. Take the 100 out of the plan, and the plan did not pay, and Mr. Hale knew it, and the Duke knew it, and Verity knew it, and none of them had yet said it out loud in a room with a table in it. He came to the gate himself on the 17th of January, at dusk, alone again, and this time he did not pretend to be looking for it. He had her 4 sheets in his coat, and they had been folded and unfolded so often that they were furred along the creases. "Mr. Hale says the wasting is spent," he said. "You say it stops at the water. One of you is wrong, and I have to choose." "You have to choose by the 25th of March, she said. "That isn't tonight." Men who confuse those 2 things build straight lines. He stood in her yard with the sleet coming off the river, and she watched him decide not to be angry, which took him about 3 seconds and cost him something. "Then teach me," he said. "Get in the boat," she said. She pulled him down the drain in the last of the light, which he did not offer to do for her, and she noticed that too. The fen at dusk in January is not black. That is what people who have never seen it always get wrong. It is the color of a pewter dish. And the sky is on the water everywhere, and the light comes up at you from underneath, and the only dark things in 11 miles are the willows and the men. She put him ashore on the north bank of the 100 and made him walk the top of it, and the ice at the edges went under his boots with a sound like somebody eating an apple. 240 acres. Empty. A great gray pan of nothing between 2 low old banks, with a heron in the middle of it standing in 3 inches of water and thinking about them. "Whose is this?" he said. "Yours. Everybody's. It's common. Your tenants have the grazing from May Day to Michaelmas, and they have had it since before there was a duke of anything. It grows nothing. It grows 400 beasts every June. It's under water half the year." "It's under water," Verity said, "so that your low ground is not." She took him along to where her grandfather had cut a notch in the coping of the old bank, a plain square notch, weathered soft, and put his hand on it in the dark. "That is the height my grandfather chose in 1730. Not God, my grandfather. He built 2 banks and left the ground between them empty on purpose, and set this notch at the level where the water is allowed to come in, and every winter since, When the river will not take what the fen sends, the fen puts it in here instead and waits. Your ground drops 11 inches and dries in a fortnight. That's the whole of it. That's the trick. And it isn't a trick. It's a purse. He made you a purse and left it lying in the fen, and it has been paying out for 86 years. And Mr. Hale has it in his schedule at 11 pounds the acre. She heard him breathe out. 240 acres at 11 pounds, he said. 2,640 pounds. That's the profit. That's what your 41 neighbors signed for. There is no other profit in that plan, Your Grace. There is only 9 miles of digging. And if you take the 100 out of it, the arithmetic dies on the table. And if I leave it in, then you have sold your own safety to pay for the tool that will drown you, and the men who bought it will be very pleased with you for about 9 years. The heron gave up on them and went, and they stood on the bank in the dark and listened to it go, and she thought that was the end of the lesson. My father let those cottages take water for 11 winters, he said. He knew. He used to say the fen was a thing that happened to us, like weather, like being born. I watched them carry Saravai's boy out of the end one on a door in the flood of 13, and he lived. And I was 27, and I stood in the road, and I thought, I will not be a man that things happen to. He was quiet a moment. So I went and got an act. That's a good reason for an act, Verity said. It isn't a reason for a straight one. He laughed. It was one syllable, and it surprised him more than it surprised her. She pulled him back up in the dark with the tide coming, and neither of them said anything for 1.5 miles, and at the gate he took her hand to step out of the boat, which he did not need to do. And she let him, which she did not need to do either. In February the water set it for them. It began on the 9th with rain in the hills, which the fen never sees and always receives, and it went on for 6 days. And on the 14th the wind came round to the northwest and blew hard and held the tide up in the river, so the fen could not empty at the ebb. And by the 15th the drain was running full lip to lip, and the gate was shut on a river 4 feet higher than the fen behind it. Verity did not sleep on the 15th. She went out at the ebb at 2 a.m. with a lantern and got 20 minutes of drawing before the tide made, and shut it again. And at 4 the wall at Herring Corner began to weep. And at 4:30 Jabez Rands came up the bank with 3 men and a lantern and stood in her yard, and he was 62 years old, and he took his hat off. He had not taken his hat off to anybody since his wife's funeral. Miss Allard, he said, what do we do? And here is where the 4 months of walking in the sleet with numbers going round in her head became a thing with hands. She did not say we should have done this in October. She sent 2 men to the head of the fen to open the doors, and she had to say it twice, because you do not let more water into a fen that is drowning, and every instinct in every man there stood up on its hind legs against her. But the fen was not drowning from the head. It was drowning because the river would not take what the drain was bringing, and the drain was full to the lip and pushing at the wall at Herring Corner, where the peat is soft. And the wall at Herring Corner had gone in 1799 and taken 9 houses with it. The water had to go somewhere, and it was going to choose for itself in about 2 hours. So she chose for it. She went along the north bank of the 100 with an axe and a lantern and Jabez Rands behind her, and she found her grandfather's notch in the dark by putting her hand on it, and she cut the bank 20 feet to the east of it, because to the east the bank is silt, and to the west it is peat, and peat does not stop when you have finished with it. She cut it herself. It took her and Rands and a man called Setchfield 40 minutes in the dark, and the last 6 feet went out with the water and took the axe with it, and very nearly took Setchfield, who went into the chest and came out on the end of Rands's pole, coughing like a horse and swearing at his own boots. And then 240 acres of empty common began to fill. And here is the part she never told anybody. Not Rands, not her husband, not the Society of Arts. The Reeves house stands on the rood, and the rood is a foot higher than Long Fen, and no higher than that. And if she had read the notch wrong in the dark, or if the northwest wind had held the tide up 2 hours longer than it did, the water she had just let out of the drain would have come round the back of the 100 and taken her own house, her own hearth, her father's chair, and the book. She had thought about that for 11 seconds on the bank, with the axe in her hands. Then she cut. It took the top off the flood in 40 minutes. The wall at Herring Corner stopped weeping by 6:30. The 700 acres of low ground took 11 inches and no more. The cottages at the fen edge took nothing at all. And the Duke arrived at 7 in the morning, in the dark, in the rain, on a borrowed horse with no hat, having ridden from the house when a boy woke him with the news that the fen had gone, and he found the fen not gone, and a young woman on the wall with an axe and her hair down her back and her father's coat black to the shoulders, and a common the size of a small sea filling quietly in front of him, with the first gray light on it. "The 100, he said. "It's what it's for," she said. "Your Grace, I've cut your bank." "I saw. I'll cut it again on Thursday if it rains." He looked at the water for a long moment. Then he took his coat off, which he should not have done, and he went down to the windlass with Jabez Rands and worked the gate at the ebb with the rest of them until 9 o'clock in the morning. And he did it badly for the first half hour and adequately after that, and by 8 Rands was telling him to put his back into it in a tone he had used on boys for 40 years. That was the 15th of February. There were about 200 people who saw some part of that morning, and by Sunday there were 1,100 who had heard about it, and by the 1st of March there was not a public house between Blakenheath and the river where a man would say out loud that Ambrose Allard's girl did not know water. Jabez Rands said it first, and said it in the ship with his hat on the table. "I laughed at her in October," he said. "I'm 62, and I've been on that drain since I were a lad, and I laughed at her, and if I'd not laughed, she'd have been heard in October, and we'd not have been on that wall at 5 in the morning. That's mine to carry." That is a thing worth remembering about that whole winter. The first man to say she was right was a man who had laughed. If you want to know how a duke who asked a room for a man ended up asking her twice, in the rain, with his hat in his hands, stay with me. And if these stories keep you company on quiet evenings, subscribing is what keeps them coming. And there was the other thing the county said about that morning, and it said it for a great deal longer. A duke had taken his coat off on a young woman's wall at 7 o'clock in the dark, and worked her windlass until 9 with his hands, and the young woman had had her hair down her back, and there were 200 people who saw it. By the last week of February, there was not a drawing room within 11 miles that had not made something of it, and what they made was not unkind, exactly, and that was the worst of it, because unkind you can answer. "Mrs." Danby said warmly, that it was quite a romance. Somebody's cousin said warmly that Ambrose Allard's girl had done very well for herself. On the 3rd of March, at Blakenheath, a subscriber's wife who had known her mother for 30 years turned her shoulder to Verity in the church porch in front of 11 people and asked the woman beside her, in a clear voice, whether it was true that the Reeves' daughter was giving lessons up at the great house. Verity went in and sat down and sang the psalm. But she sat there doing the arithmetic she had been avoiding for a fortnight, and it came out like this. If she went on now, And if she won, there was not one soul between here and Lynn who would say she had won it with a book. They would say she had won it in a bedroom. Every reading her grandfather ever took, every first Sunday in the rain, every one of the 274 entries in that black leather thing with the broken spine would become a joke told about a pretty girl and a young duke. And the joke would outlive all of them. And the next time somebody's daughter stood up in that assembly room with a book against her chest, the room would already know what to think of her. That is what the talk cost. And Verity Allard paid it in full and never once mentioned the bill. It is also why 3 weeks later, standing in her own yard in the rain with a duke's hat turning over in a duke's hands, she did not say yes to the second question. Not that night. Not for a while. Now, you would think that settled it. It did not settle it. That is the part nobody tells you. She had a book, a post, a church, a rector, a cut bank, 240 acres of proof lying in the fen in plain sight, an axe, and a fen man who had taken his hat off, and on the 4th of March the Court of Sewers for Longfen met at the Assembly Room at Blakenheath and voted 9-4 to let Mr. Hale's contract on Lady Day exactly as drawn. She was heard. This time. That was the cruelty of it. Sir Hollis Danby, in the chair, was courteous to her for 40 minutes. She laid the book on the table and the churchwarden's account and the 4 sheets and the number 9, and men leaned forward, and one of them asked a question so intelligent that she answered it for 6 minutes without breathing. And then Mr. Hale spoke for 20 minutes about the North Level, and Sir Hollis said, "Miss Allard, nobody here doubts your father," and they voted 9-4. Because the evidence was not what was being weighed, and she had known it since she was 9 years old and had let herself forget it for 1 hour in a warm room. And the Duke of Stanmere voted for the cut. He did it with his eyes on the table, and he did it in a steady voice, and afterwards in the passage by the coats, he came and stood in front of her. And she waited. And he said, "I gave them my word in front of the whole county before I ever heard of you." And she said, "I know." And he said, "That is not an excuse. It is an account of what I am." And she said, "I know that too," and put her hat on and went home in the rain. And the contract would be let on the 25th of March. And on the 26th, the Reeves Gate, 300 years in its stone, 60 in its timbers, would be pulled down, because Mr. Hale's line came through the Rawdon, because the Rawdon was the only firm bed for 9 miles, because there is only one place in Long Fen where a man can put an outfall and stand on it while he does, and that place is 1/4 of an acre of dead Roman river called the Reeves Rood. And on the 18th of March at 9 o'clock at night, sitting at her table with nothing left to do and the book open in front of her at the page for 1813, Verity Allard picked up her bookmark and unfolded it and read it for the second time in her life. It was 3 inches by 5. It was in Mr. Auchenpeart's small, tidy hand. It was dated the 9th of February, 1813. It said, "Verity Allard, spinster, daughter and next heir of Ambrose Allard, deceased, admitted tenant to the customary tenement called the Reeves Rood, with the gate thereon and the drawing thereof, to hold to her and to her heirs according to the custom of the manor. Fine, 1 shilling. She sat very still for a long time. Then she went out in her nightgown and her father's coat, and stood on the rood in the dark with the lantern, and looked at the gate, which she had drawn and shut 4 times a day for 3 years, without once understanding that it was hers. Copyhold of inheritance. The oldest, dullest, most unkillable form of holding in England. Not a lease, not a favor, not a wage. A tenement held by the custom of the manor, passed to the heir, entered on the roll, and no lord of any manor in this kingdom could take it from her without her hand on the paper, and no act of Parliament could take it either, unless the act had listed it in the schedule, with a clause for compensation and a notice and evaluation and all the slow machinery that Parliament builds to stop exactly this. And the Long Fen Drainage Act, which the Duke of Stanmere had carried up to Westminster himself and read out loud in a thin house on a wet Tuesday, did not list it. It could not list it. Because 19 years ago, when Mr. Peart made up the rent roll, he had looked at a quarter acre with the Duke's gate on it and the Duke's wall running out of it, and had written it down as demesne, as the Duke's own. The act scheduled every rood of Long Fen except the one rood the whole plan had to stand on, and it scheduled it wrong, in the steward's hand, and the steward's own admittance of her, in the same hand, was folded up inside a dead man's book being used to keep the place at 1813. She did not sleep. She did not smile either, if you want to know, and she did not go to bed working out how to make anybody kneel. She got the book, and the churchwarden's account, and the 4 sheets, and she sat down and wrote out, in her best hand, 7 terms. Lady Day, the 25th of March, 1816, came up cold and bright and then went gray by 10. The letting was in the assembly room at Blakenheath. The same room, the same tall windows, the same smell of wet wool and burned coffee, and there were more than 40 men in it this time because contractors had come from Peterborough and Lynn to bid. Verity walked in at the back with mud to her knees. Sir Hollis Danby saw her, and his face did what a kind man's face does when he thinks somebody is about to be hurt in public. Mr. Hale was unrolling the white paper, and she went up the room, all of it, in the quiet that fell as she went, and she laid 3 things on the table in front of the chairman. Her father's book, the churchwarden's account of 1793, and a folded paper 3 inches by 5. "Mr. Peart," she said, "would you read that, please? It's your hand." Ocean Peart picked it up. It took him about 4 seconds. She watched 19 years go through the man's face. He put it down on the table and he put 1 finger on it as though it might get away. And he said, in a voice that carried to the back of the room because the room had stopped breathing, "This is my writing. I wrote this out for her at the Court Baron on the 9th of February, 1813, and I entered it on the roll, and the roll is in my strong room 40 yards from this table, and any man who wants to see it may come with me now." He swallowed. "And I made up the rent roll in 97, and I put that rood down as demesne, and I have never looked at it since, and it is not demesne, and it is not his grace's, and it never has been. It's hers. The gate stands on her ground, and the drawing of it is her right by the custom of the manor, and that is the beginning and the end of it, and it is my fault, and I have been wrong in this room for 4 months, and I was wrong in it in October, and I'd like that written down." Somebody at the back said something. Sir Hollis said Mist Hale, because there was still the sum to do, and Mr. Crispin Hale, whatever else he was a man who did the sum. He asked for the map. He asked for a rule and 10 minutes, and he got 15, and the room stood about while a stout sandy man in gold spectacles walked his dividers across a piece of white paper, looking for a way through Long Fen that did not touch a quarter of an acre. There is no way through Long Fen that does not touch that quarter acre. The nearest firm bed to the west is 2.5 miles off, and it is not firm. It is silt over peat over nothing. And to put an outfall on it, you would drive piles for a year. He put the dividers down. "Sir Hollis," he said, "the Western line is 11,000 pounds, and 2 seasons at the least, and I would not warrant it then. This act stands at 9,400, and it lapses at midnight. It cannot be done." And then Crispin Hale, who had written her that good letter, and had been wrong in it, and had never once sneered at her, turned round to the room and said the sentence that made her think better of him for the rest of her life. "And it should not be done," he said. "I read the young woman's papers in December, and I answered them with the North Level, and the North Level is not this fen, and I knew that when I wrote it. I have been engineering the plan I was engaged to engineer. She has been engineering the fen." Sir Hollis Danby turned to her. 40 men turned with him. "Miss Allard," he said, "what is it you want?" She did not want money. While Mr. Hale was walking his dividers, Mr. Peart had gone along the table and bent to the Duke, and the Duke had sent the chairman a folded note, and Sir Hollis had read it out because he was too honest to do anything else. £800 for the Rood, at once, in bank paper. She had said no before he finished the number, and 40 men had heard her do it, which is the only reason the next part worked at all. "Water does not argue," she said. "It only arrives. You can be as clever as you like at it, and it will not notice you. So there are 7 terms, and I'll have them all, or His Grace may buy his pumps." And she read them out. "That the gate stands, and the wall with it, and both are kept in repair by the commissioners forever. That the drain is not straightened, but widened on the line my grandfather laid, and the fall is left as he left it, 1 inch in 3 miles and not 1 inch in 1. That the doors are shut on the 1st of May, and the water held up all summer at 4 feet, and the drain works from November to March, and not 1 day of it in July. Whatever any gentleman thinks of the look of it, that the 100 is written into the schedule as washland forever, unenclosed, unplowed, unsold, and any man who puts a plow in it answers to the commissioners. That the 11 cottages at the fen edge are taken down and rebuilt on the Rodden at the estate's charge before Michaelmas. That the office of Dyke Reeve is confirmed with its wage and its duty, and the duty is this: the post is read on the 1st Sunday of every month, and the number is entered in the book, and the book is laid before the commissioners every Lady Day forever, whether anybody wants to hear it or not. And that Mr. Crispin Hale is retained to widen the drain, because he is the best engineer in England, and he has just proved it by saying so out loud in front of 40 men. That last one she had not written down. She added it standing there, and Hale's ears went red, and Jabez Rand's laughed like a gate. It took until 7 in the evening. The contract was signed at 7:10, on her terms, all 7, with the amendments written in between the lines and initialed in the margins in 11 places, and at 11 o'clock that night, by lantern, in the rain, on the line Ambrose Allard's grandfather laid out in 1730, 2 men cut the first spit of turf with the whole of Blakenheath standing round them holding lights, because the Act said the works must be begun by the 25th of March, and there was 1 hour of the 25th of March left in the world. So, the rain. At about 9 that evening, between the signing and the turf, the Duke of Stanmere walked the last half-mile in it, because the horse would not go on, and he stood in the yard outside her gate with his hat in his hands and the water running off him, and he asked her for 2 things. The first was the gate. He asked her to draw it at the ebb before dawn, so that the lighters carrying Mr. Hale's timber could come up on the flood at first light, and the works could go on without losing a day. He asked it formally and awkwardly, and as though she might say no. "Yes," she said, "of course. Go and stand out of the rain." And then he did not go and stand out of the rain. He stood in her yard with his ruined hat in his hands, 31 years old, a duke, wet through, And he said, "In October I asked this county for a man who understood water. I have had my answer, and I have had it every day for 5 months, and I have been the last man in the fen to hear it." He turned the hat over. "I was wrong about the line. I was wrong about the 100. I voted against you on the 4th of March, knowing what I knew, because I had given my word to men in a warm room, and I would rather have drowned my own land than looked small in front of them, and there is no version of that I can dress up for you." He stopped. That was the first thing. The second thing is that I am asking you to marry me, and I am aware of exactly how this looks. On this day, in this yard, at this gate, and I would rather ask you badly tonight than well next month, because if I wait a month you will have decided what I am. She did not answer him. She picked up the key and put it on her shoulder and went out onto the wall, and after a moment he came after her, and they worked the gate through the ebb and the flood, drew at 10:30, shut at 1, drew again at 4:30, with the rain coming sideways off the river, and he was by then adequate. They did not talk about it. There was too much to do, and the wind was wrong. And at 6:10, on the morning of the 26th of March, 1816, the rain stopped, and the sky went that color it only goes over a fen. And Verity Allard set the staff on its brick beside her father's iron post, and read the level, and read it again, because a number said once is only a rumor, and wrote it in the book, and shut the book. Down the drain, on the flood tide, the first lighter came up through the open gate, with a mast full of Mr. Hale's timber, and a man on the pole singing something disgraceful. She looked up at the Duke. "Yes," she said. "They were married in September in the church with the mark on it, in the rain, in the worst summer anybody in England could remember. 1816. No summer at all. Frost in June, wheat black in the ear in 3 counties, bread at 1 shilling and 1 penny in Blakenheath and men on the roads, and the 100, which was not enclosed, and was not ploughed, and was not sold to any subscriber at £11 the acre, was under grass, because the water had come off it in May the way it had come off it since 1730, and it carried 400 head through that black year, and men came from 3 counties to lean on the gate and look at it. And the 700 acres of low ground grew wheat that would have frightened a Lincolnshire man. 3 years later, on a drain that will still be there when the pumps are all bought and paid for. Mr. Crispin Hale widened the crooked drain in 2 seasons, and never once tried to straighten it. In 1817, he read a paper to the Society of Arts on the wasting of drained peat, and printed the readings entire, 24 years of them, with the names of Ambrose Allard and Verity Ashworth on the head of the table and his own underneath. And every August for the rest of his life, he wrote to her for the first Sunday number, and she sent it, and neither of them ever mentioned the North Level again. Sir Hollis Danby voted for the cut in March, and voted against enclosing the 100 in June, and told the story for 20 years as though he had been on her side from the beginning, which is how most men survive having been wrong. And Mr. Ocean Peart kept his place, because she asked that he should, and made up a new rent roll in the spring of 1816, and wrote in the Reeves Rood with a pen he pressed so hard it came through to the next page, and it is still there, and you can see the mark. She was a duchess for 41 years, and she read the post on the first Sunday of every month for every one of them. There is a brass collar on the iron now, and a duchess in a black bonnet, on a brick, in the rain, with a broken oar for a stand, and a fen that has come down 4 inches in 40 years, instead of 40 feet. Her daughters read it after her. It is being read still. I keep thinking about that first Sunday in October. The room, the laughter, and a young woman with a dead man's book against her chest who had to sit back down. Because that is where most of it ends, isn't it? That's where it ends for nearly everybody. She had the truth in her arms in that room, and the truth lost. 9 votes to 4, and it did not begin to win until she opened a bookmark. So tell me which one you'd have been that morning. The one who stands up in a room that is already laughing and says it anyway, or the one who goes home and looks for the paper that makes them listen. Both of them are in this story. Only one of them got the gate. Next time I'll tell you about a woman who was sent a bill for her own dowry, and I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. So leave your town in the comments and I'll read them out. A 1-room house on a 1/4 acre of Roman silt. A lantern in the window. Black water going out through an open gate under a low gray sky, and no sound at all but the ebb.